If you haven't tried the Cycles approach to phonological therapy yet, you are missing out. It's an amazing therapy method that is especially designed for children who are highly unintelligible and those who have multiple phonological processes or sound error patterns. So, the idea is that you take all the speech skills that this child needs to work on and you cycle through targeting them each for 1 week or maybe two before moving on to the next one. And the result is that these children make faster progress on their whole speech system improves more quickly than if you were just targeting one sound at a time. I'm Carrie Clark, and in this episode of the Speech and Language Kids podcast, I'm going to show you exactly how to use the Cycles approach in therapy and show you where you can download some pre-made materials to make it happen. So, welcome to the podcast. If you want any of the notes that I'm going to give you today, you can find those at speechandlanguagekids.com/cycles-podcast. And I will have all of the notes of what I'm talking about today, along with any of the links I share as well. So you'll have an easy way to access those. All right, so I want to tell you kind of where this whole Cycles approach kit course came from that I created. So for those of you who don't know, this whole company of Speech and Language Kids started with me sitting on the couch of the duplex that I shared with my then fiance, now husband, and just blogging about what I was doing in my therapy room. I would talk about what my kids were working on. I would talk about how I would break down the skills that they were working on into these step-by-step plans. And at some point during one of those blogging sessions, I wrote very vaguely about the Cycles approach, just as a, hey, this is a thing that exists. Here's a little bit of information about it. And that was it. It was just one of my many blog posts. So fast forward years later, I now have a much bigger business and a much bigger website. And I was at one point looking at my analytics and trying to figure out what kinds of content to create, what kinds of courses to create. And I found that Cycles approach blog that I had created once upon a time had blown up, and I was doing really well for it in terms of search results. So if you type in the Cycles approach to speech therapy, my website comes up pretty darn high on the rankings. And I thought, okay, cool. I'm going to make some materials. I'm going to make a course, a webinar on the Cycles approach. But the problem was I hadn't actually used the Cycles approach very much, and so I wasn't intimately familiar with it. And I don't like to present anything that I don't really know well. So I started doing my research. I started reading about the approach and looking at the actual research from Barbara Hodson. And one of the things that I came across in my research was a super duper handy handout. And so, sometimes there's some good stuff on those super duper handouts. So I opened that one up and I immediately scrolled to the bottom, because that's what I do on those handouts, is look at what the sources were, because I like to use the original sources when I am creating courses and creating materials. So I looked to see who Super Duper had cited, and obviously they cited Barbara Hodson, but one of their few sources that they had was me. It was Speech and Language Kids website. It was that very vague blog post that I had created years past, and I was being cited. And I thought, come on, Super Duper, you could do better than that. But that's when I realized there really was this lack of information out there on how do we actually make this happen? How do we break this down into an actual therapy plan that people can follow? The research is great and it's amazing, and Barbara laid out this amazing program, but the actual how do I do it piece was missing. So I did what I do best and what I love doing, which was dive into that research, dive into the very technical writings on how to do this, and translate that into something that you can actually just grab and go and do in therapy. So that is what I created. I created a course and I have some materials, and I'll give you that. The links to that are on the show notes over at speechandlanguagekids.com/cycles-podcast if you want those. But this today is going to be a crash course. So I'm going to give you kind of the brief overview of the actionable steps to using the Cycles approach in therapy. I'll give you a couple examples, and then I'll show you where to get the rest of it. All right. If you guys are watching with me live inside the hub right now, welcome. I see you all in there. If you guys have any questions as we go along, go ahead and put those in the chat, and then that way I can include that in the podcast. And if you are listening to this later and you want to be included in our live recordings, you can go over to hub.speechandlanguagekids.com. I record those live inside the hub so we can take questions and have some participation in there. And that's included in the free membership, so you can do that as well. Okay. So let's start with what is the Cycles approach to phonology. So this is also called the Cycles Phonological Remediation Approach. It was created by Barbara Hodson as a way to help children who had a lot of phonological processes make faster progress in therapy. So a phonological process is a sound error pattern. So it is not just one single sound that they're struggling with, but maybe a whole class of sounds like fricatives, which are our long sounds like f and s. Or maybe it's a sound error pattern like dropping off the final consonants of a word or dropping off the beginning consonants. It's basically a rule that the child has in their head that they use to simplify speech. And we see phonological processes in young children all of the time. They always simplify their speech because it's complex and their mouths aren't ready yet. But over time, we expect children to stop using those at different times for each process. And when we see them continue to be using those up through elementary school age, then we have a phonological disorder or delay, and we can start working on that in speech therapy. Some of them we can start when they're younger than elementary age, down to like age 3. We can start on some of those, and some of them we don't worry about until they're older. But basically, this approach, the Cycles approach, was specifically designed for those kids who are using a ton of phonological processes, so their speech is very hard to understand. And Barbara Hodson's research shows that these children can improve their intelligibility faster by cycling through all the different phonological processes that they need to target instead of just targeting one at a time. So she laid out an amazing program that walks you through all the steps, but like I said, it's a little technical. So I'm going to give you the crash course, and then I'm going to give you the step-by-step inside the hub if you need that. Okay, so let's start with how do you choose which phonological processes to target when you're using the Cycles approach. The lovely thing about this approach is that Barbara Hodson was very specific on this and how you do this. She laid out what she calls the primary set. So this is the first set of processes that everybody starts with in the Cycles approach. The key, though, is you only choose targets that the child is stimulable for, meaning that they can do it if you help them, okay? So if they're missing the K sound and you try to get them to make K and they just cannot, that is not one that you target right now. You might try that the next time on your next pass through if they're ready then, but the key is positive practice. The key is to make sure that they are practicing the things that they can do over and over and over instead of practicing it wrong, okay? So what are those primary sets? So again, all of these notes are over on the show notes. If you're watching with me live right now, you can find the Cycles page inside the hub. But if you are listening to this recording later, I think this one's going to launch at the end of December, then you'll be able to go to speechandlanguagekids.com/cycles-podcast. Yes, that's correct. And then you can see all of these. But here's the primary set. So here are the first 5 phonological processes that you start with. So first is syllable deletion. So if they are reducing 3-syllable words to 2-syllable words, or 2-syllable words to 1-syllable words, you work on that in the first set. Sound deletion. So if they're deleting final consonants or initial consonants, you work on that. S clusters is the third one because this significantly improves intelligibility. And so S clusters like SP, ST, SL, even if they are young and we're not necessarily worried about that S sound yet, being able to include this in the first set is going to improve intelligibility much more quickly than a lot of other processes that we could be working on at this age. So S clusters gets included if they're stimulable. That's the key. Next, number 4 is fronting or backing. So this is working on velars like K and G if they are fronting those, or working on alveolars like T, D, and N if they are backing them. Okay, so whichever one they're doing, we work on that. And then the 5th process in the Cycles approach in the primary set is liquids, and that is L and R. And this one is the only exception to the stimulability rule. So you target liquids every cycle, even if they are not stimulable, okay? Even if they are 3, 4, 5, and not necessarily needing to work on the L or R, but again, it's going to help their intelligibility. So if you're working on L or R and they're not stimulable, we're just going to be emphasizing the vowel to suppress the W. So all we want to do for that is just turn our R from a W to a We're just trying to get it a little more vowel-y, okay? So again, I go into way more detail inside the hub and inside the course, but those are the first targets that you include in your first cycle. I have a question over in the hub. Hang on. Is this a cycles webinar or somewhere we can ask general support questions? Oh, no, you're good, Jessica. So this is our podcast. We're doing the podcast recording. You are definitely welcome to ask questions because that is part of what we're doing here is that participation piece. But we do have a full cycles webinar inside the hub, inside the full paid membership. And so you can find that as well if you need more in-depth. But we're going to do a crash course today. No, you're totally good, Jessica. Okay. So let's talk about round 1 then. So we've talked about which phonological processes you're going to target. So then you're going to grab specific sounds or phonemes that you're going to target for each one for round 1. So your first step is just setting up your first cycle, right? So you are going to include any of the processes from that primary set list that they're currently struggling with and that they are stimulable for. Okay, so if they are leaving off if they are reducing the number of syllables in words in conversation, so they're reducing those multisyllabic words down to shorter ones, they're leaving off syllables, and you can get them to do it maybe butterfly by clapping it out. If they can do it, then that goes on the first set. That goes on the first round. If they are deleting final consonants, that goes on the first round, if you can get them stimulable. If they're deleting initial consonants, that goes on the first round. And so I'm actually going to pull up, for those of you who are watching me live, I'm going to pull up this screen that has our planning sheet. So inside the kit I created is this planning sheet, and it just goes through each of those initial processes and then lets you check which one they're struggling with, and then it lets you decide which target you're going to use. So for each of those phonological processes that you're targeting, you're going to choose at least 2 phonemes or examples to practice with, okay? So if they are deleting initial consonants, let's say, then you could choose initial P, initial B, initial M, whatever they're stimulable for, that's what you would include. And you're going to pick 2 of those to target for initial consonant deletion. Then you're going to go on to final consonant deletion. Okay, well, we're deleting final consonants too. So let's pick final P and final K if they're stimulable, right? So you just pick 2 examples from each process to add to your list. And right now we're just assembling the list, right? So you can see if you're inside the hub watching, or if you go to the show notes, you can see that planning page where you would just check a couple for each process of, for the syllable deletion, 2-syllable words or 3-syllable words. You can pick 1 or 2. Initial consonant deletion, you pick which initial consonants you want to work on. If it's S-blends, you're going to pick the S-blends that they're stimulable for. If they need to work on velars and they're stimulable, you'd pick which are you going to do, final K, or initial G. And I just written it all out exactly the way Barbara Hodson laid it out, okay? So you pick the 2 sounds that you're going to work on for each process. Each sound you picked is going to be targeted for 60 minutes of therapy, which should be 1 week, maybe 2. So that could be 2 30-minute sessions, 3 20-minute sessions, whatever the child can tolerate. And you're just going to work on each sound for 60 minutes. And then even if they don't get it, you're going to move on to the next one because we're cycling through. Okay? This is a lot, and this is why there's not a lot out there on this, because it's hard to wrap your head around, but once you do, then it makes sense. So those of you who are in here with me live, let me know if this is making sense in the chat, or tell me if you have questions, because it's a lot. I'm going to keep talking through the examples though, okay? So that should help. Okay, so we have our planning page. We mark out which ones we're going to work on. So let's talk about what we actually do in the therapy sessions. So, as I mentioned, you're going to target each phoneme for 60 minutes or 1 week of therapy. Here's what you're going to do during each of those sessions. Step 1 is review. You're just going to practice last week's words, no big deal. Step 2 is auditory bombardment. So you're going to read a list of 12 words that contain the target. This should take you about 1 to 2 minutes. So if you get through 12 words in 30 seconds, read them again. And we're just reading them over and over again. Barbara Hodson recommends having some sort of amplification, but if you don't have that, that's okay. So let's do an example. Let's say we're working on final P, and that's our target this week. So I would be reading a whole bunch of words that all have the P at the end of the word, okay? And I'm just reading those over and over again. The third step of this therapy session is going to be to create some target word cards. So you're going to choose 3 to 5 words that contain the target, so 3 to 5 final P words that the child is able to say, remember positive practice, and you're going to either have them cut those out and paste them onto index cards or just write the words on the card and draw a quick little picture so they can remember what it is. Somehow you need them to have 3 to 5 cards with their target words. Then you're going to practice them over and over and over again through play, while playing with crafts, while playing dress up, while jumping on a trampoline, while swinging on a swing. Doesn't matter what you're doing. The idea is just how many times can you get them to say those words over and over and over again. Positive practice, okay? Once you've done most of your session on positive practice, right at the very end, you're going to do a quick stimulability probe for next week's words. So, okay, next week we're going to work on final M. So I'm going to run you through a couple of final M words to figure out which ones you're stimulable for and write those down so that I can have those ready for next week. And then we're going to repeat our auditory bombardment of the final P words, the ones we're working on today. Repeat that one more time. And then send home those cards with the client to practice at home for 2 minutes a day. So like I said, it is a very specific program that Barbara Hodson has laid out. All the steps are there for you. Do you have to follow it exactly? Absolutely not. Use your professional judgment. But this gives you a framework and a guide for where to start. And this is how you can run this program. And then next week, you just move on to that next one, right? Okay, next week we're on final M. So now we're going to do that. The week after that, we're doing initial SP words. And then we're going to do that. And you run through all of those cycles, every target that you selected on your planning page. And then, oh, hang on. I got to stop. There's a question. I'm not even paying attention. Sounds like what you talked about in the MTS course for language, though. Wide and shallow, not narrow and deep. Yes. Yeah. So for our multi-tiered system of supports that we talked about for language therapy, we talk about, okay, are you going to work on one language skill in depth, or are you going to work on a lot of language skills and just touch on each one to help them build their full language system? That's exactly right, Jessica. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about hitting each phonological process a little bit instead of focusing on one until they master it. And what the research is showing is that this works. It helps them improve their full phonological system faster instead of just focusing on one skill and mastering that before you move on to the next. So once you get through your first round of skills, your first round of targets, you're going to reevaluate and you're going to start over. And you're going to say, okay, how are we doing in conversation? Have any of those been mastered yet? If not, we're going to hit them again on round 2. If they have mastered them, let's say we've done a couple of cycles now and wow, these are actually sounding really good in conversation, then we can check for stimulability again and figure out which processes they need to work on next. Barbara Hodson has a secondary set. So once you get through the first set of processes, she says, okay, now here's what you work on next. And so she has very specific requirements that you have to meet before you move on to the secondary set. But it is, and that's all included in the course too, but it's all laid out, right? So you know exactly when to work on things and how long to work on them before you move on. And that how long is based on how they're doing in conversation. So this is not necessarily a program where we're saying, okay, we're going to keep working on final consonants. Now we're going to work on them in sentences. Now we're going to work on them in open-ended questions. Now we're going to work on them in conversation. You're working on them in isolation in this cyclical way so that it generalizes to conversation on its own. Now, obviously, if you have a student that you've been doing this with and they're not generalizing this and you've been working for a while, then it may not be the right approach for that student and you just switch to a different approach or you modify it to what you need. But this is the way the cycles approach is laid out, and the research shows that it works for a lot of kids. All right? Okay, those of you who are in here live, what questions do you have on that? And then we do, like I said, we do have a course on this inside the hub, inside the full paid hub membership, and we have a materials kit. So my materials kit starts with that planning page that I described where it gives you specific examples of which ones to work on. And then each of those has a worksheet. So final P has a worksheet. Final T has a worksheet. Final K has a worksheet. And this is different than what you've probably been doing with your cycle or with your phonological kids, because we're not doing minimal pairs. We are specifically targeting one phoneme of that process, or one example of that process. So we're not doing S blend minimal pairs. We're just targeting initial SP if they're stimulable for that, or initial SW if they're stimulable for that. Okay? Does that make sense? I know it's a lot. If you would like to access any of those resources, again, those are inside the hub at hub.speechandlanguagekids.com. That also has our discussion board, which you can access for free. You just have to have a free account, and you can come in there and ask questions. So if you have questions about the cycles and how that works, pop in there and ask me those questions, and I'll help walk you through it. But you'll also be able to find in the full membership, you can find the course and the materials kit in there as well. Just search cycles at the top and you'll find those. Or again, you can go to our show notes if you're listening to this for speechandlanguagekids.com/cycles-podcast. All right, what about children with mixed SSD? Jessica, spell out SSD because all our acronyms are different throughout the world. So they have a lisp, but also are unintelligible due to multi-phonological processes. Okay, I see. Yep, speech sound disorder. Yeah, so that's a great question. And it basically comes down to your professional judgment on what they need the most, what would help them the most. A lot of the times, the phonological processes make the child more unintelligible than the lisp. So I will target those phonological processes first because I think that's going to make the most functional difference for the child. But there's also nothing to say that you can't work on both. Maybe one of your cycles, you just throw in a cycle of lisp work, just working on getting the tongue in the right place for that S sound, right? So that would not necessarily be something that you can't do, right? It's not part of the cycles approach. So maybe you just say to yourself, okay, I'm not following the cycles approach exactly, but there's nothing that says that you have to, right? So if you feel like working on that lisp would help, throw in a cycle for that. Or maybe you say, okay, this trimester we're going to be working on the lisp. Next trimester we're going to do some cycles. So you can play with it and decide what you think will help. But I definitely like to choose the thing I think will help them the most in their everyday communication. That's what I like to start with. Does that help? Okay, I see some more people typing. So if you have more questions, put those in. Brilliant, thank you. But would you need to leave the S cluster out though? I don't think so. So if they had a lisp and you get to the S blends, we're less worried about distortions with the cycles approach than omissions. So if they are not able to put an S and another consonant together to make a blend, if they're not stimulable for that, then we're not going to target it. But if they can do it and it just sounds a little slushy, or we can see their tongue sticking out between their teeth and it's a little lispy, I'm not so worried about that. Because again, not having it there at all is going to make it harder for them to understand than if they just have a distortion. So distortions we're not so worried about in the cycles approach at this point, right? Eventually we're going to work on that. Eventually we're going to want it to be nice and crisp and clear. But at first we just want them to be there. It's kind of like if you're familiar with the successive approximations approach from Nancy Kaufman that she uses for the apraxia kids. That's her approach for that is we just want to get close and then we'll refine it later, but we just need to get closer than where we are. So yes, I would not necessarily leave it out just because of a distortion. Got it. Thank you. Okay, good. All right, let's see. I have a child that is hypernasal. He's 3. He can say apple, but when I ask for K. All I hear is N. Sheep is shin. Okay, so hypernasal kids, number one is we need to get that checked medically first. We do not do speech therapy for nasality issues until we have medical clearance because we can make it worse. So make sure that they've had some sort of a medical check. Usually that's going to an ear, nose, and throat doctor and making sure all of the structures and functions in their nasal cavity and oral cavity are all working the way that they're supposed to. We don't have any submucous clefts that we missed, any of that kind of stuff. So that's step one. And then step two would be considering that for therapy. If you get that medical clearance, trying to figure out how to get that oral production. So you could use a cycles approach, especially if they have a lot of sounds they're working on, but you would want to make sure they're stimulable. So can they say that K sound by itself without it turning into an N? If not, you don't target it in cycles. If they can, then we could start working some of those into our cycles and help with some of that hypernasality. Does that make sense? You guys have great questions today. I love this. Awesome. Thank you. You're welcome. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the podcast for today. If you're still typing your question, go ahead and put it in. But keep in mind, we can continue these conversations inside the hub. We have that free membership. And then if you want to get the paid membership, you can get the Cycles course and materials kit as well. I just found you and I'll be coming back. Oh, good. I'm so glad you found us, Tracy. We're excited to have you. All right. I'm going to finish this up. If you guys are with me live tomorrow, I have one more podcast recording. We're trying to preload all the ones over the holiday season so I don't have to record them while my kids are home. So we have one more tomorrow on functional communication. And then we'll be resuming our podcast recordings, our live recordings in January, starting on January 6th, hopefully, if I'm back up and running by then. And then we will have lots more stuff coming in the new year. So I encourage you to hop over to the hub and check us out. Come in, say hi, use our cool new therapy material generators that I created inside the hub. If you haven't seen those yet, ask me about that inside. But yes, I'd love to see you guys in there, and we'll see you on the podcast next week as well. All right. Bye, guys. Have a great day.